Are we way too complacent? Do we think that, we're just going to be the world leader no matter what? And that's everybody's going to accept that.
We never thought 9/11 would happen either.
Right.
And, it hasn't been so long ago for many of us that 9/11 happened, and it was a reality. And the Red Dawn reality here could happen as well. And, like you said, an EMP burst or something like that. I mean, what could 3 EMP bursts over Alaska do to Alaska as a whole? It could darken all the major cities if they struck over the major cities like Anchorage, Juneau, Fairbanks, which is where several of our bases are. Are our shelters and aircraft shelters and stuff like that, are they prepared, or can they handle an EMP blast? Depends on what you read and who's written it. But that ensuing chaos would also provide an excellent time to, get a foothold on Alaska if they wanted to get a foothold on Alaska.
Is another U.S. border region in danger? Are you paying attention? Are you watching the news? Are you hearing what is happening? Not in Ukraine, not in Israel, not on the U.S. southern border, but in Alaska? In Alaska. We are not paying attention, people. We are not paying attention. I know you may say to yourself, like, well, what could be in Alaska? What's going on over there? What's happening in the region of Alaska? Well, we have had Russian jets, flying overhead, invading our airspace there. We have seen, the Chinese and Russian military naval operations right off our coast in Alaska. And believe me, our U.S. intelligence and Department of Defense are now starting to pay attention. But are we ready? Are we capable of defending ourselves? Look at what's happening on the southern border. Our president just opened up that border over the last 3.5 years, wide open to not only the criminal cartels and the human trafficking organizations, but to our adversaries like China and others like Iran. And now we see what's happening in Alaska. Believe it or not, Russia is only 25 miles off the coast of Alaska, folks. And if the Kremlin saw an opportunity to attack America, he could inflict a ton of damage before we even knew what happened. And why? Because we're not paying attention. We're not taking care of America first. We are not listening to the people who know what is happening in Alaska. And those are the people that live there. Both former military, current military, as well as Indigenous Alaskans and people who are part of their defense forces. Russia has divisions specifically trained in Arctic combat. And the Kremlin would love to get its hands on our oil and other natural resources. We know that. Why hasn't leadership in Washington taken any action whatsoever to protect our country? I have a veteran, author, and national security expert on the show today who lives in Alaska. And we are diving into the ways that Russia could attack us and how American leadership has absolutely failed to prepare us for this Russian aggression. And by the way, you think about Red Dawn, you think about, those movies that appear to be science fiction. Well, guess what? Look at what is happening in Ukraine. It's not a Ukraine military that's fighting those Russians. It's basically the entire country of Ukraine, including its young and its elderly. What would happen to America if we were attacked? And guess what? You, my friends, every single one of you and every single family member would be part of that defense. You would be part of the military. You don't want to miss this episode. But first, let's talk about Goldco, folks. This administration, it wants you taxed to the brink, under the thumb of the IRS and controlled with a digital dollar. That's why thousands of hardworking Americans right now, including myself, are turning to Goldco. Yes, I'm telling you, I want to diversify. I want my money to be safe and secure. And you can do that with gold. And right now they have a great offer, a free 2024 gold kit. Learn how to possibly get, listen to this, $10,000 in bonus silver as a listener of this show, The Sara Carter Show. They've helped people like you and me place over $3.5 billion in gold and silver. This is serious. I can tell you this. I know people all across the board in the bureaucracies, especially law enforcement and our federal law enforcement, right? From the DHS to ICE, Border Patrol, FBI, people are preparing. They are preparing because you never know what can happen. Listen to this. Precious metals ownership is an important part of your overall retirement and a saving strategy. Protect your family's financial future and freedom. Get started today at Sara, S-A-R-A, likesgold.com. That's Sara, S-A-R-A, likesgold.com. Get your free gold kit from Goldco and learn how to get $10,000 in bonus silver. Sara, S-A-R-A, likesgold.com. That's Sara, likesgold.com. I'm so grateful to have you on, Shane. This is Shane Land for all you folks out there who don't know. He is a disabled combat veteran of Iraq. You're an independent researcher, and this is so exciting. You're the author of The Arctic Guerrilla Defending Alaska. You're a former U.S. Air Force security specialist, U.S. Army combat medic, and intelligence analyst. Department of the Army Civilian Federal Intelligence Research Specialist, and defense contractor. I love this. You have such background on being able to explain what life is like in Alaska and why we should be paying attention to it. Thank you so much for being on the Sara Carter Show, Shane.
Thanks for having me, Sara. It's an honor to be here, and thank you so much.
Oh, no, the honor is all mine, really. I mean, you've served combat missions, overseas assignments. You've been in Germany, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, Mozambique. I was in Afghanistan for covering the war for about 8 years. I've been to Iraq. I understand the intensity of those battles, of the war. My husband fought as well in Afghanistan and lost his sight in Afghanistan on a combat mission there. So I understand we have enemies all over the world. And sometimes we're just not even paying attention. Sometimes our enemies are right at our back door, right?
That is correct. And here in Alaska, it's becoming even more apparent daily that our enemies are at the door of Alaska. And it's not just Russia, it's China as well.
Let's talk about that, because that's why I wanted you on the show. I think it's astonishing that we pay so little attention to what happens. I always say at our borders. That my focus has always been the southern border for a long time. I focused on the drug cartels, narco trafficking, the nexus between terrorist organizations and those cartels. And now, of course, adversaries like China who are taking advantage of our southern border. But Alaska is a border we're not even thinking about half the time. I mean, it is a state. It borders with Russia. It is, the Russians are 25 miles from our Alaskan border. And I mean, we don't think about the consequences of ignoring that territory.
No, there's always a waxing and waning interest, I believe, in the Arctic region as a whole. It's been that way for 2 decades or so. It's nothing new. We've really started kind of paying more attention to it over the last 5 or so years, but still not enough interest is being taken in the region, and specifically here for Homeland Defense in Alaska. I mean, Little Diomede and Big Diomede Island are 25 miles out in the Bering Strait. Big Diomede is owned by Russia. Little Diomede is owned by the United States. And then 30 miles or so away, there's the Russian, eastern seaboard and eastern coast. And so, we're here in Alaska. Western Alaska is closer. In actuality, it's closer to Russia than, say, Havana was to Miami during that whole crisis. And you would think people would pay more attention to that fact and what all goes on in the Bering Sea. And it's interesting you brought up, what all you've done down on the southern border. That all ties in here as well. We just recently had a drug bust up here that broke up a drug ring, a fentanyl ring, It was actually being run out of a California prison all the way up here in Alaska, and they're pushing that fentanyl and those other narcotics out to these very remote villages. So you're looking at a logistical transport process from the southern border all the way to Alaska.
That's incredible to me. A fentanyl ring all the way up in Alaska connected to the California prison systems. I'm sure there's a lot of cartel involvement in that. We know Miami is a big cartel, I guess, U.S. based kind of Mexico connection cartel out of the U.S. prison systems. But I didn't even think of the fact that they would be moving it into territories in Alaska. Have they? Has there been an increase in fentanyl usage in the Alaskan territories? What do you think's going on there?
I think that there has been a steady increase in that, as well as other narcotics coming in up here, especially out in the remote village areas where law enforcement presence is minimal at best. If troopers have to go out to investigate, most of the times they have to fly from a central hub, catch a bush plane into these smaller villages, and they're tremendously understaffed. Our law enforcement up here, the troopers, local law enforcement, they're all tremendously understaffed up here. And of course, Alaska is so large, just the area we live in here in the Matsu Borough, it's the size of the state of West Virginia. And we only have, 4 or 5 troopers on at any given time during maybe a 12-hour shift to cover that entire region. So, and it's difficult for them to, they have to figure out things that are more important. If they get a call to come out, say if there's a burglary or a home invasion attempt or something like that, there might be something else going on that they have to take those assets and send them elsewhere instead of, coming to where we are, or maybe, they're a lot of times it's, as I've been told, we kind of hope you guys are able to take care of yourself out there. So.
Right. It like kind of puts everything into perspective about how remote people are out there and what can happen right under our noses. Just last week, Russia was caught flying planes. Like we've seen that before in the Alaskan air defense zone. How often does this happen? And has this happened more recently? I mean, we've seen China expanding as well, its reach, letting us know, hey, we're watching you. We saw that with the balloon that came across the United States, starting in Montana and moving its way across. I mean, are these real threats? Are they really letting us know, hey, look, we are thumbing our nose at you, or we are watching you, and you just better watch out? I mean, what is going on here?
I think that the threat is very real. The Director of National Intelligence made that very clear a few years ago, that the threat here is very real. Just recently, as you pointed out, we had NORAD was, tracking or detected and tracked 4 Russian planes off the coast here in Alaska. Well, what you didn't see maybe in the NORAD press release was that had happened 3 times out of 4 days since February 5th. So it happens pretty frequently. And, typically what is reported is just the tip of the iceberg of what is actually going on up here. Over the summer, we had, 11 naval warships, Russian and Chinese joint task force, sail through the Bering Strait. The year before that, there were 7. And we have minimal to no naval presence up here. And so, patrolling that area and actively patrolling that area is something that is an avenue of approach for our adversaries, no doubt.
One of the things that I think is most astonishing to me is that we're not capable right now, according to the Heritage Foundation and others that I've spoken to, analysts, of fighting a 2-front war. I mean, we are being spread so thin across the globe. I mean, financial resources, of course, Ukraine, we're seeing a ton of financial resources there, whatever we're supplying overseas, even if it's issues with Israel, even if it's targeting terrorists. But we as a military force right now are lagging behind some of our adversaries, and we're spread thin. If we were to be attacked on an unexpected front, or if something did happen, we would we would pretty much be toast, it appears. Like, if we're not ready to fight on these two fronts, I mean, our enemies will have the upper hand. I mean, it will take a lot for us to combat this. Kind of like, I think, the same situation we were in World War II, when we had to really get in gear and really build up our forces in the middle of a war.
Yes, absolutely. And, history has shown that fighting a war on two fronts is not only difficult to do, it also typically results in, losing one of those fronts. And we even saw this, even in the geographically region, of Iraq and Afghanistan simultaneously. We saw this kind of happening. Our forces were getting stretched thin, multiple deployments, coming home for a short period of time, going back. And it's that push and pull that really thins us out. And we've seen that, the military services have been missing their recruiting goals by tremendous numbers. And that's a sign of probably, maybe things to come. And I mean, I hope not. But, if we were to have to commit, say, troops in the Arctic, say elsewhere, to Norway or Sweden or Finland or something, because of Russian activity or Chinese activity or near peer acts, whatever you want to call it, it would stretch us thin here. I mean, the personnel here belong to Indo-PACOM Command. So they can be pulled from here in Alaska and sent to, help out with something that could happen in Taiwan. So that would leave us very thin here as well.
Right now, do you know how many troops we currently have in Alaska, or how vulnerable we are to Russian activities there? I know that we do have the Alaska National Guard, and there's a lot of training that takes place with them, right? And most of them, I heard, they're indigenous to Alaska, or they are people from Alaska, but I don't know how many of them are actually indigenous to Alaska.
Well, we have the 11th Airborne Division that just came back online up here recently. Men and women just phenomenal at what they do. Unfortunately, they're not, as admitted in the Arctic strategy for the Army, they're not ready or prepared for extended operations in such a harsh environment. It's not that they don't want to do it, they're not capable of doing it with equipment that they currently have. It's a very sharp learning curve up here in this cold weather region. It's hard.
How cold does it get up to where you're at right now? How cold can it get?
Today we're having a heat wave. It's currently 26 outside. And but last week we were down to minus 30, minus 31 here. Up in the Fairbanks area, they were at 52 or 50 below. So it gets cold, and the farther north you go and you approach that Arctic Circle line, the conditions get way harder, which all that impacts satellite coverage. It impacts communications, whether it's cell phones, computers, whatever the case may be. And all of these things were identified and have been identified in the Air Force Arctic Strategy, the Army Arctic Strategy, the DoD Arctic Strategy. So they know these issues exist, and they're doing what they can to correct them or overcome them. They just need the support to do so. And I'm not quite sure, to answer your question, how many troops they have here. And if I didn't know, I don't think I would probably want to put that out over the air. I think
true.
What we do is we give a lot of information away online. But with the National Guard, there's probably close to maybe 4,000 or more in the National Guard. But the ones that are kind of the most indigenous, that live in these really remote areas, are part of the Alaska State Defense Force, which is an all volunteer, all the time organization of men and women, many of which are prior service. They live in a lot of very remote areas that the active component forces and even the National Guard forces have never even been into. Like the State Defense Force has personnel on Little Diomede Island.
I think that's absolutely incredible. Like, it never occurred to me, but like, I don't think we know enough about this. I'm like, I want to go up there and just hang out with you and go with the defense forces out in the remote wilderness. I mean, I may freeze to death. People say that is the only time I actually become a baby, is when I have to like go below. Like it was negative 26 in Iowa. And I was down there, of course, covering the election. And I was, the primary, I guess that would have been the caucus. And I was down there for the Iowa caucus. And I went down to REI and I got myself the 850, down REI jacket. I
Right,
said, I don't need the Canada Goose. We don't need to spend $1,700. I
right.
will get the $350. You can warm me up with that 853, whatever it is, goose down. It was great. But I was cold. But you're hardy people. And this is the difference. People who live in those conditions know how to survive those conditions. They are adaptable to those conditions. Do we spend enough time talking to and learning from the indigenous Alaskan tribes that are there and people that are there about what we need to do to defend that territory?
In my opinion, I don't think we do. I don't think we do at all. Even though planning
Wow.
and strategy suggests throughout their documents that that's a significant portion of their strategy is to develop relationships and get in and learn from the indigenous people about ways to not only survive in the Arctic but to thrive in the Arctic as well. Like you said earlier, this when we were talking, these people, these tribes, and these native people have been living here long before we ever came. So why would you not want to seek out that knowledge? Um,
Absolutely.
and in the areas where I most firmly believe something would likely happen would be in and around a lot of those native communities that are very remote. And if we had to try to get, say, special forces in there at some point in time, after the fact, lessons we've learned in Iraq and Afghanistan about relationship building with indigenous cultures and understanding the culture is very important. And the Army and the Air Force, they all recognize this. I don't understand why they're not being more proactive in their approach to doing that.
I think that would be central to any type of defense mechanism that we would put in place, especially right on our border. Right, we would want to have that. But then again, you and I both saw what happened in Afghanistan from beginning to end, and what happened in Iraq. And our men and women are amazing. The indigenous people that we trained or fought with, those that were on the ground, part of our special forces operation, were incredible. And the U.S. strategy was, in my opinion, it failed. It failed to a large extent. Taliban is in control. Al Qaeda is in control of Afghanistan. That has been lost to us now. We see Iraq right now is under the control of the Iranians, in my opinion. And we really put so much blood and sweat and tears into these operations that it's heartbreaking. But I think what we're talking about is even bigger than that, right? Because this is about our country. And right now, we know Russia and China are cooperating in the Arctic. They have been working in a way together symbiotically to try to hone in on that Arctic Circle. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that presents a threat to us? I mean, it is pretty obvious there are adversaries, but
Right. Well, with China, claiming themselves to be a near Arctic nation, and Russia being the largest Arctic nation, and like you said, they've been working in this symbiotic relationship with each other, and it's been coming along. So, where Russia is bringing China along in the Arctic for what they call, scientific and research expeditionary purposes. I think we all know that there's underlying tones to that,
mhm.
intelligence gathering, and sharing of information. Of course, then you saw the buildup, or you've seen the buildup over the last several years of, the three dedicated Arctic brigades in Russia, building new bases, opening old ones, refurbishing airstrips, and everything like that. So there's that buildup, and all that kind of goes along with that, the establishment of that northern sea route that will benefit both countries tremendously, especially if, say, President Putin decides to claim total control to that maritime access of that route, which, maybe he's planning to do, maybe he's not.
Are the people in Alaska worried about that? Worried about those reports about what President Putin may be attempting to do? I mean, I saw the whole Tucker Carlson interview, and Vladimir Putin is very, I mean, he is a wordsmith, and he can definitely work around almost anyone. It was pretty incredible watching him throw his little dossier at Tucker. That was my opinion. I still haven't talked about it publicly, but how he would throw little tidbits of information over at Tucker, like, hey, remember when you wanted to be a part of the CIA?
Yeah.
Hey, remember when it was like he was pulling out his like knowledge from a dossier? But we've seen Putin follow through, right? He's followed through. He followed through with Russia, with Georgia, when he said that's it, and he went into Georgia. We saw what has happened in Ukraine with regards to Crimea and Donetsk. I mean, and then of course now the ongoing war in Ukraine, and now he's saying, hey, wait a minute, you know what? Looks like we might be needing to take this one back. Do you think is it just talk, or do you think he could actually do it?
I don't know if it's as much talk or posturing as it is messaging. Like when I watched the interview as well, and I got a lot of messaging that he
Right.
conveyed, and he spoke in a lot of metaphors, which which I understood because my experience in Afghanistan, a lot of the Afghan elders would speak in metaphors, and you have to be an active listener. I also thought he caught Tucker by surprise by saying those things, out of a dossier. You can kind of see the surprise on his face, like, "Well, where'd you get that from?" But I think that there is some messaging of course, they didn't talk about the Arctic region, but I think there is some messaging there coming for dialogue, both in the Arctic and in Ukraine. My takeaway about what he talked about with Ukraine was, hey, I'm willing to sit down and talk, but let's put everything on the table and get past all the nonsense that's going on, and let's talk. If we're serious about it, let's talk. And I think that message he conveyed, I think the Russians want out of that situation in Ukraine, but all along, while we were focused on Iraq and Afghanistan, combating terrorism and stuff like that, they have played the long game in the Arctic, and they've played it very well up to this point where we are now, and we're just, unfortunately, we're way behind where they are.
Let's talk about that long game, because this is what your book, The Arctic Gorilla, which I think is everybody should get, because if you want to learn about something you would never had thought of before, this is a book that could definitely open up your eyes to how direct that threat is to our country. But The Arctic Gorilla, Defending Alaska, talk a little bit about that. What are some of those situations as an analyst that you're looking at and you're saying, well, wait a minute, we need to take a better look at this, because this is happening right under our noses? It was kind of like my big, wake up call when I was talking at the beginning. I would say maybe more towards the end of the Trump administration, when I was finding out about the Chinese putting in Huawei 5G systems into towers in Montana that weren't even operational. So it was like, we actually let China into our country and their own workers to kind of take over our towers. And years later, the FBI investigates, or we're allowing them to buy our land right under our nose. It's crazy. Or move fentanyl into the United States. What is it about Alaska that's going to make me go, oh my gosh? I mean, I already feel like I'm there, but like, this is crazy. How did we let this happen?
Well, Alaska is it's a very, very long way from the flagpole of DC. It's even it's even a very long way away from the flagpole of Colorado Springs, where NORAD and Northern Command are, and it's a long way from Indo-PACOM Command. But and with it being that way, I think a lot of times it gets overlooked, or it's, oh, they're way up there in the high north. They'll have to handle things. If something were to happen, what's our order of battle going to be to get troops and supplies and equipment back in there? one of the biggest things, I wrote a scenario out back in the fall of 2020 based on the first 96 hours of what a potential invasion of Alaska might look like. And in that, I based it on historical information that had happened since I had been kind of closely monitoring the situation since 2017. I took all of that and I developed a scenario of what the first 96 hours might look like. And, we're very vulnerable in the Western Alaska. We're very vulnerable. But there is existing critical infrastructure out there, say in Nome. There's, an airport. There's a port there that they're currently building onto make it a deeper water port. But this scenario that I developed, and I ended up sending it to several commanding generals across several commands, and even the Alaska, what they call the Alaska Organized Militia here, which is the National Guard, State Defense Force, the Naval Militia. They call it ACOM. Sent it to them as well, because they have the State Defense Force again has people in them where the National Guard doesn't. You would think that they would, but there's very few there. They closed a lot of facilities up here in Alaska, but the danger is coming, in my opinion, the danger comes from Bering Strait. That's the danger area. But it would all potentially start, with taking out critical facilities, early warning detection systems that down even as far down into the Aleutians and around Western Alaska. And if you were to take the current situation map of Ukraine and where the Russians, or that whole kind of eastern, southeastern, southern portion of where the Russians and all the fighting is taking place, if you were to flip that up and then flip it over to the left, you could overlay that over Alaska and see where kind of my scenario, how it played into what's going on currently in Ukraine. And I think that would be the Russians and the Chinese would want our natural resources, and to invade Alaska as a whole would be a losing effort. It's just too big of an effort to undertake.
That's pretty incredible, because we know President Vladimir Putin had threatened in the past and definitely brought up in the past, these kind of, I would say, his decree that, maybe Alaska really belongs to them. Maybe Alaska, based on Moscow's, and this is according to a Newsweek story, Moscow's historic real estate holdings abroad, that maybe that should be returned back to Russia, and I mean, do you really believe that he would even attempt that? I mean, what would cause that trigger to be pulled, because
that would be something that might work. I think it's messaging on his part to engage in dialogue about the Arctic region. Maybe using Alaska as an example, but I don't think that if there were to be some type of event, I think it would be in tandem with the most opportune time up here. Is we have a lot of earthquakes up here. We have a lot of natural disasters here. We have earthquakes here on a daily basis. And again, that's like living with the brown bears and the black bears here. It's just something you live with. And, some of them are more severe than others. But I think if there were to be one that was, tremendously catastrophic, that might be a good time to exercise or push the edge of the envelope, so to speak, with maybe a Russian-Chinese venture towards Alaska.
Y'all know how much I love My Pillow. My dogs sleep on the My Pillow dog beds. I sleep on the My Pillow pillows, and I've got the My Pillow mattress topper on my beds. I love, love, love Mike Lindell's brand, and I want to share it with you. Why? Because I love American companies and I want to see America succeed. And right now you can get My Pillow's best prices ever and free shipping on your entire order. That's great, right? Savings include 50% off My Pillow 2.0, 50% off brand new flannel sheets that just arrived, and they will not last long. Trust me, folks. And on those mattress toppers I was talking to you about, they really do change a mattress. If you feel like your mattress is old, you got to get one of these. They're 100% made in the USA, and right now they're as low as $99 $99. Cannot beat that. Save on brand new kitchen towels that have the same technology as the bath towels they actually absorb. Visit mypillow.com/Carter and enter code Carter, CARTER, at checkout for free shipping and huge discounts, including the Giza Dream bed sheets for as low as $29.98. Go to mypillow.com/Carter, CARTER, code Carter, mypillow.com/Carter, code Carter, CARTER, or call 1-800-685-7221. Do you think that we've become way too complacent, Americans, and even our military and our government, that we assume that the world is always going to be structured the way it is right now as we're seeing it, and we underestimate our enemy or adversary's capabilities, that we could be just sitting here and all of a sudden we think Red Dawn's a movie, but all of a sudden you're like, hey, who's coming in over my mountains? Or what are these people doing? Or what happens if we're hit with an EMP? Or what happens if we lose our ability to communicate?
Chaos.
There is total chaos, right? Do you think that so back to the question, are we way too complacent? Do we think that, we're just going to be the world leader no matter what, and everybody's going to accept that?
We never thought 9/11 would happen either.
Right.
And, it hasn't been so long ago for many of us that 9/11 happened, and it was a reality. And the Red Dawn reality here could happen as well. And, like you said, an EMP burst or something like that. I mean, what could 3 EMP bursts over Alaska do to Alaska as a whole? It could darken all the major cities if they struck over the major cities like Anchorage, Juneau, Fairbanks, which is where several of our bases are. Are our shelters and aircraft shelters and stuff like that, are they prepared, or can they handle an EMP blast? Depends on what you read and who's written it. But that ensuing chaos would also provide an excellent time to, get a foothold on Alaska if they wanted to get a foothold on Alaska.
Look, we saw it happen. We saw it happen in Israel, right? October 7th, Israel, great defense systems, great border, the Iron Dome. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes, talked to IDF. Everything looked like it was in place. And yet on the Sabbath, hardly anybody was really operational. They didn't have a lot of people right there on the border actually visually working. They were relying a lot on their technology. I mean, I think sometimes we're just not paying attention. It's like not seeing the keys sitting right on the table when you're looking for them all over the house, and they're right there. Like sometimes I think our enemies are just blatantly obvious and we just don't want to see it. Either purposefully we don't want to see it, or we have just become so comfortable we can't believe what we're seeing.
Yeah, I think it may be a combination of all those things, but I think complacency is definitely something that we have, again, we grow accustomed to things being the norm, whereas, and I think President Putin brought this up in his interview. He talked about, our leadership recognizing that the world is changing, and you either choose to accept it being as you think it is, or you accept the fact that it is changing in the direction that it is. And I think we see that here in Alaska and in the Arctic region. We're definitely seeing that change.
But our leaders aren't, right? But in your opinion, is Washington seeing it? Are our leaders seeing it? Or is our DOD seeing it? Or are they just seeing something completely different?
And again, it goes back to what I said, that the interest in the Arctic region waxes and wanes. And I think, you have Senators Murkowski and Sullivan here from Alaska. You have Congressman Mark Green, a couple of other ones that are on the Homeland Security Committee that are taking tremendous interest in the Arctic region, especially to the Homeland Defense situation and Homeland Security situation here in Alaska. You're seeing that happen. You've seen recently the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies was opened here in the Anchorage area. There's the Center for Arctic Security and Resilience Studies at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, which puts out a lot of great information. And then most recently, they just awarded DHS Science and Technology Division just awarded, I think, $46 million to open up a new center, another center at University of Alaska Anchorage. So now you have 3 centers of, strategic studies, for lack of better wording, that are getting tremendously focused specifically on the Arctic and the homeland. But the problem there happens when you have the worlds of academia and the worlds of national defense perspectives, and when they collide, they don't always produce, the desired outcomes. It's because everybody has their own perspective on what that looks like.
Right. And then they leave us vulnerable. And the people of Alaska are going to have to be picking up their own. You got to get your guns.
Well,
you got to get your guns and get your supplies.
And the people of Alaska are very resilient. And, we have a lot of veterans here, retired military, we have a lot of veterans here. And, and people that live in Alaska, you have to want to live in Alaska and live here. But, I think as far as the political support that, the state of Alaska needs for the ACOM and the Alaska Command needs and, the Air Force, well, everything that they need has to start with awareness in Washington first. And it has to be an invested awareness. It can't just be a passive awareness and say, oh, well, the Arctic's come up again. Here, let's talk about it in a couple of sessions, and then we'll come back to it a year from now. It can't be that. It has to be an invested interest, just like both Senators Murkowski and Sullivan have. But unfortunately, it's an uphill fight right now, and it shouldn't be.
Who's blocking them?
I don't know that there's anybody blocking it as much as I think what is blocking it is lack of interest in being so far away. I mean, if you really wanted to understand Alaska, if you want to understand the Arctic, you're not going to understand it from D.C. You've got to come up here and spend some time in it. You've got to spend some time with the people and listen to what they have to say. And you've got to get out there and you've got to experience what it's like to be cold and understand what our soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines will go through potentially if a conflict happens here or in any other Arctic nation.
So basically, I got to go down there and do the show right from Alaska and make them watch it, make me freeze.
I think that would be a fantastic idea.
I got to do that. I know Mark Green very well. I wish I knew Lisa Murkowski better. I would love to. So I think I need to make a plan on going into Alaska. I think it's a fascinating story. And I actually think we don't pay attention to it until we get our bells rung by a bunch of, Russian fighter jets, and the Chinese playing these tactics, these kind of war game tactics and saber rattling by our shores. And I think that that's unfortunate, that we should maybe be on the offensive, right, instead of the defensive on these issues. And by the way, I think it's a fascinating story and a fascinating place in the world. Let me ask you this: where can my listeners get your book, get to know you better? Where can they, as far as learning more about Alaska, where can we go? Is there a particular, not just your book that you recommend, but a particular website or something you would like to direct them to?
There's countless resources available online. The Alaska Federation of Natives. You can Google search, DoD or Defense of Alaska, Homeland Security Alaska. You can Google search all these things and pull up a mountain of information on what's going on up here. And it goes back to what I said earlier about there's got to be awareness. And unfortunately, a lot of what goes on up here doesn't get reported down there. Something like, these bombers and fighters, buzzing Alaska, Defense Identification Zone airspace. It happens so frequently that it just doesn't get reported anymore, or much at all. It's kind of like, oh, well, in the news again, this happened off the coast of Alaska, and everybody sees it and goes, oh, okay, well, how does that impact me here in Georgia? How does that impact
Right.
in Indiana? How does that impact us here? And what it does is that, you know, you got to see the bigger picture strategically.
Well, and why would China and Russia be sending their naval ships, in near the Alaska, near the coast?
Yeah.
Why would they do that? They wanted us to know that they were there.
Yeah.
They wanted us to know that they were there. And that to me is a very significant statement.
And it's also messaging as well from the perspective of, we've all been so focused on Ukraine and what's going on in Israel right now that, Putin has said, hey, there's still stuff going on up here. You guys are all focused over here, but don't forget about, what's going on over here. And we have coming in next month, we're having the 2024 Arctic Winter Games, which is, all pretty much all teenage kids are the competitors. And every nation is coming except for Russia. And I think Putin, in his, interview with Tucker Carlson, he spoke about sanctions here and sanctions there. And he spoke about all that. Well, I found out just the other day, I called and asked, well, why is Russia not coming for the third consecutive year?
And what is the statement that Russia is trying to make by saying, hey, we're not going to participate in a game that they obviously would do very well at?
Right. You've given them a platform for an information operation to show, just like he said in his messaging with Tucker, was that he was given a platform to give to the world that the message is nobody wants Russia around. We're the big red threat. We're the big red devil. And that's what's being conveyed. But, here we are 3 consecutive years of the Arctic Winter Games, and now they're being hosted here in Alaska next month. And what I was told specifically, and it played right into what he said on the interview, I was told specifically they weren't coming due to sanctions. And I thought, wow, that was their statement to me. Well, due to sanctions, they weren't invited.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Yeah. And, and so you're giving them you're giving them a platform, for an information operation that, they can reach a global audience, just like, the interview did. He's got a global audience if they choose to capitalize on conveying that message.
It looks like we need to be smarter at messaging, and it looks like we need to be smarter at what we're doing if we're going to have the upper hand on Russia and China, especially when it comes to our own security and how we are perceived by the rest of the world. Shane, this has been an amazing interview. I actually am so excited to be going to Alaska. I know I'm going to do this. I just saw my husband. He walked in, and I know it's something I've always told him I wanted to do. I just hate being cold. But anyways, The Arctic Gorilla Defending Alaska, that's your book. I look forward to meeting you in person one day. I also look forward to having you back on the show. So if there is another significant naval operation by China and Russia off the Alaskan coast, even if next week they decide to buzz us, I want you back on the show to talk about it.
Okay.
I really appreciate
I would
having...
Love to be back on the show. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, it's been awesome. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Thank you so much, Shane, for being a part of the Sara Carter Show. This is really important information, and I'm so glad that we have experts like you to break it down for all of us. God knows we need it, and God knows our government is not doing its job for us the way it should be. Please make sure you're subscribed to the Sara Carter Show on your favorite podcast app. I don't care if it's Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us keep the show free, and it really gives us a boost in the algorithm. If you're watching on Rumble or YouTube, give us a like and a follow as well. Thank you so much for being a part of the Sara Carter Show. Follow me on Truth at Sara Carter Official, on X at Sara Carter DC, and on Instagram at SCarterDC. God bless you. God bless our great nation. God bless the state of Alaska, and God bless the great state of Texas.